walked into Dad's 60th birthday party wearing my dress blues, the same uniform I'd earned through 4 years at West Point and 6 combat deployments. I brought the commendation letter from my commanding officer and the acceptance notice for Advanced War College that had arrived that morning. But when I stepped into the living room, Dad took one look at me and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "There's my daughter, still playing soldier instead of getting a real job." 3 days later, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Major Reynolds, this is the Pentagon. You've been selected for the World Security Conference as the youngest military strategist in U.S. history." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Captain Sarah Reynolds, and if you've ever had your dreams dismissed by the people who were supposed to support you most, this story is for you. Growing up in suburban Phoenix, I was surrounded by expectations that never quite fit. My father, Richard Reynolds, ran a successful accounting firm downtown. My mother, Patricia, managed the local country club with military precision, though she'd never served a day in uniform herself. But it was my grandfather, Colonel James Thunder Mitchell, who shaped my world. Every summer, while other kids went to camp or lounged by pools, I spent my days at the VFW post listening to his war stories. Grandpa Thunder had served in Korea and Vietnam, and his study was a museum of medals, maps, and memories. At 8 years old, I'd sit cross-legged on his carpet while he explained battle strategies using salt and pepper shakers as opposing forces. "Sarah," he'd say, moving the pepper shaker around the coffee table, "warfare isn't about strength. It's about thinking 3 moves ahead while your enemy is still figuring out move 1. He handed me a small compass that had been with him through 2 wars. "If you ever decide to serve, this will always point you toward what's right." That compass became my North Star. While my classmates dreamed of prom dresses and college parties, I dreamed of West Point. I threw myself into everything: debate team captain, varsity soccer, student body president, and a 4.0 GPA. I studied military history until I could recite the tactics of Patton and MacArthur. When Dad asked what I wanted for my 16th birthday, I said, "Help me prepare for the West Point entrance exam." His face fell. "Sarah, be realistic. You're a smart girl. You could be a lawyer, a doctor, run a business. Why would you want to waste your potential playing G.I. Joe?" "It's not playing, Dad. It's serving." "Serving what? Some politician's agenda? You'll never make real money. You'll never have a normal life." But Grandpa Thunder believed in me. He spent hours helping me prepare for the physical fitness tests, teaching me leadership principles, and connecting me with his old Army contacts who could write recommendation letters. When my acceptance letter to West Point arrived, he was the first person I called. "I knew you had it in you, kiddo," he said, and I could hear the pride crackling through the phone. Dad's reaction was different. "4 years of your life down the drain," he muttered, then walked out of the room. At West Point, I found my purpose. The discipline, the honor code, the brotherhood, it all clicked. I graduated 3rd in my class and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in military intelligence. My first assignment took me to Fort Bragg, then overseas to Afghanistan, where I proved myself in ways that mattered. But every time I came home on leave, Dad's disappointment hung in the air like smoke. He'd introduce me to his friends as, "My daughter, the one who joined the Army." Never with pride, always with a slight apologetic tone, as if my service was something that needed explaining away. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't just following orders, I was learning to give them. My first real test came in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, during Operation Desert Shield. As a fresh 2nd lieutenant, I was assigned to the intelligence unit under Colonel Marcus Webb, a gruff veteran who didn't believe women belonged in combat zones. For the first month, he gave me desk work, analyzing reports that other officers had already reviewed, filing paperwork, and making coffee runs. But everything changed during the Zarai district crisis. Taliban forces had been intercepting our supply convoys using an unknown route through the mountains. For 3 weeks, our senior analysts couldn't crack their pattern. Supplies were running dangerously low, and morale was dropping fast. That's when I noticed something everyone else had missed. While reviewing satellite imagery at 2 a.m., I spotted inconsistencies in the terrain photos. The Taliban weren't using existing roads. They were creating temporary bridges across seasonal riverbeds that only appeared during specific weather patterns. I cross-referenced meteorological data with attack timings and found the correlation. They had a 3-day window every 2 weeks when the water levels dropped enough for vehicles to cross. I presented my findings to Colonel Webb the next morning. He stared at the map spread across his desk, traced the route I'd identified with his finger, and looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "Reynolds, if you're right about this, you just saved a lot of lives." My prediction was spot on. We intercepted the next convoy attack, captured 15 high-value targets, and secured the supply route. The operation was so successful that it became a case study at the War College. But when the commendations were handed out, I watched Colonel Webb accept the Bronze Star for exceptional strategic planning and intelligence analysis. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was about the mission, not the recognition. That pattern continued throughout my deployment. I developed a new protocol for identifying IED placement patterns that reduced roadside casualties by 40%. The technique was implemented across 3 provinces and later became standard procedure. Colonel Webb presented it at a NATO conference in Brussels. My name appeared in the footnotes as Research Support Staff. When I rotated back to Fort Bragg, I was promoted to First Lieutenant and assigned to the Strategic Planning Division. Here I thought things would be different, but I quickly learned that the military, despite its emphasis on merit, still operated on an old boys network that was hard to crack. My breakthrough came during a simulation exercise designed to test response protocols for a hypothetical terrorist attack on American soil. The scenario involved coordinated strikes on 3 major cities, and traditional response models called for dividing resources equally among all 3 targets. But I saw a fatal flaw in that approach. Working through the night, I developed an alternative strategy that prioritized rapid containment over equal distribution. Instead of spreading our forces thin, my plan called for overwhelming response to the primary target while using intelligence networks to prevent secondary attacks. The simulation results were staggering. My approach reduced projected casualties by 60% and neutralized threats 40% faster. This time, I made sure my work was documented properly. I submitted the report directly to General Patricia, the base commander, with copies to multiple departments. When the Pentagon requested a briefing on innovative counterterrorism strategies, General Hayes had no choice but to send me. Standing in that briefing room presenting to 3-star generals and defense secretaries, I felt something I'd never experienced before. They were listening to me, not through me. One general called my strategy paradigm shifting. Another recommended it for immediate implementation in Homeland Security protocols. For the first time in my career, my name was on the front page of the report, not buried in the acknowledgments. Captain Sarah Reynolds was becoming someone the Pentagon knew by name. The betrayal came from someone I trusted completely. Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison had been my mentor at Fort Bragg, the one officer who seemed to genuinely support my career advancement. He was everything I aspired to be: brilliant, respected, and apparently committed to breaking down barriers for women in the military. It started when Morrison assigned me to develop a comprehensive strategy for cyber warfare defense. This was cutting-edge territory in 2018, and the Pentagon was desperately seeking innovative approaches to protect critical infrastructure from foreign cyber attacks. Morrison told me this was my chance to shine, my opportunity to create something that would establish me as a thought leader in military strategy. For 4 months, I lived and breathed that project. I collaborated with NSA analysts, interviewed cybersecurity experts from Silicon Valley, and studied attack patterns from Russia, China, and North Korea. I developed a 3-tier defense system that combined traditional military tactics with modern technology. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Creating digital bunkers that could isolate and neutralize threats while maintaining operational capacity. The breakthrough moment came when I realized we'd been thinking about cyber warfare all wrong. Instead of building walls to keep attackers out, my system created a maze that would trap them inside, allowing us to study their methods while feeding them false information. It was psychological warfare adapted for the digital age. Morrison reviewed my work with enthusiasm. "Sarah, this is revolutionary," he said, spreading my diagrams across his desk. "This could change how we approach national security. I want to present this to the Joint Chiefs myself." I was thrilled. Finally, someone would champion my work at the highest levels. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the base commissary when my colleague, Captain Lisa Chen, slid into the seat across from me. Her expression was troubled. "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it," she said quietly. "Morrison just gave a presentation to the Joint Chiefs about revolutionary cyber defense strategies." My heart started racing. "That's great! Did he mention how the briefing went?" Lisa shook her head slowly. "He presented your entire system as his own creation, called it the Morrison Protocol. Your name wasn't mentioned once." The world seemed to tilt. "That's impossible, Lisa, you must have misunderstood." "I was there, Sarah. I was taking notes for the Admiral. Morrison stood up there for an hour explaining, quote, his three-tier system, his digital maze concept, his revolutionary approach to cyber warfare. He even used your exact terminology." I felt physically sick. 4 months of my life, my most innovative thinking, stolen and presented as someone else's genius. I stormed to Morrison's office, knocked once, and walked in without waiting for permission. "Sir, I need to discuss the Joint Chiefs presentation." Morrison looked up from his computer, completely calm. "Ah, Sarah, great work on the research for that project. Your input was valuable." "Input?" "Sir, that was my entire strategy, my concept, my research, my innovation." His expression didn't change. "Captain Reynolds, you need to understand how the military works. Junior officers contribute to senior officers' projects. That's how knowledge moves up the chain of command. I refined your ideas, added strategic context, and presented them at a level appropriate for the Joint Chiefs. You stole my work." Morrison's face hardened. "I mentored you through a complex project and gave you invaluable experience. That system wouldn't exist without my guidance. Besides, who do you think the Joint Chiefs would rather hear from? A captain with 3 years of experience, or a lieutenant colonel with 20 years of proven service?" I stood there, speechless, realizing that my mentor had been grooming me not for success but for exploitation. "I suggest you focus on your next assignment and remember that cooperation, not ego, builds military careers." That night I called Dad, desperate for support, for someone to validate my anger. Instead, he sighed heavily into the phone. "Sarah, this is exactly what I was afraid of. The military isn't a place where individual achievement matters. You're just a cog in a machine." The Morrison incident wasn't isolated. It was a preview of what my military career would become. Over the next 18 months, I watched a systematic pattern emerge that made me question everything I thought I knew about merit-based advancement. It started with small things. My tactical assessments would disappear from my desk, only to reappear as collaborative efforts in other officers' presentations. My innovative training protocols were implemented base-wide but credited to the strategic development team, rather than their actual creator. When I raised concerns, I was told that teamwork and humility were essential military virtues. Then came Captain Bradley Stone, fresh out of West Point with a degree in political science and a father who happened to be a Pentagon procurement director. Stone was assigned to my unit as my supposed equal, but within weeks it became clear he was being fast-tracked for opportunities I'd been working toward for years. The most blatant example came during Operation Atlas Shield, a joint training exercise with NATO forces in Germany. I had spent months developing the logistics framework, coordinating with 6 different countries, managing supply chains across 3 time zones, and creating contingency plans for 12 different scenarios. The operation was so complex that officers from other units came to study my organizational charts. But when it came time to present our findings to the NATO command, Colonel Harrison chose Stone to lead the briefing. "Captain Stone has excellent presentation skills," Harrison explained when I questioned the decision. "This requires a polished, diplomatic approach." I watched from the back of the room as Stone presented my work to international military leaders. He stumbled through concepts he barely understood, mispronounced foreign military terms, and couldn't answer basic questions about the logistics systems I'd designed. Yet when the presentation ended, he was congratulated for his outstanding organizational capabilities. The next week, Stone was recommended for the Advanced Command School, a program I'd been trying to get into for 2 years. But the pattern wasn't just about Stone. I began noticing how opportunities were distributed across the entire base. Men with mediocre performance reviews were selected for high-visibility assignments. Women with exceptional records were consistently assigned to supportive roles that never led to advancement. Captain Jennifer Martinez had developed a revolutionary training program that reduced injury rates by 30%. The program was adopted Army-wide under Major Thompson's name. Lieutenant Susan Walsh created a new communication protocol that improved mission coordination by 40%. It became known as the Patterson system after her male supervisor. I started documenting everything. I kept copies of my original reports, time-stamped my file submissions, and began sending myself emails detailing my contributions to various projects. I wasn't paranoid. I was preparing. The breaking point came when I was passed over for promotion to major for the second time. My performance reviews were stellar, my innovations were being used throughout the military, and my peer evaluations were outstanding. Yet I watched as officers with half my accomplishments and none of my strategic thinking received promotions. During my feedback session, Colonel Harrison delivered the news with bureaucratic detachment. Captain Reynolds, you're an excellent officer, but you need to work on collaborative leadership. The promotion board felt you might benefit from more experience in team-oriented roles. Sir, with respect, what specific collaborative leadership skills am I lacking? Well, for instance, your recent tendency to assert ownership over projects. The military functions on collective achievement, not individual recognition. I realized then that my competence had become a liability. Every innovation I created, every problem I solved, every strategic breakthrough I achieved, was being used against me. I was too good at my job, and that made other people uncomfortable. That night, I made a decision that would change my career trajectory forever. I would stop sharing my innovations within the existing structure. Instead, I would begin building something that couldn't be stolen, a reputation that reached beyond the people trying to contain me. I started submitting articles to military journals under my own name. I began speaking at civilian conferences where my ideas couldn't be appropriated by superior officers. The call came at 03:00 hours on a Tuesday in March. The voice on the other end belonged to my mother, but it sounded hollow, unfamiliar. Sarah? You need to come home. Grandpa Thunder had a massive stroke. The doctors don't think he has much time. I caught the first flight out of Norfolk, still wearing my combat fatigues, clutching the small compass he'd given me 20 years earlier. By the time I reached Phoenix General Hospital, Grandpa Thunder was unconscious, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed like a mechanical lullaby. I sat beside his bed for 3 days, holding his weathered hand and telling him about my career, about the innovations I'd created, about the battles I was fighting that had nothing to do with foreign enemies. On the 3rd day, his eyes opened one last time. He couldn't speak, but he squeezed my hand and pointed to the bedside table, where a manila envelope sat with my name written in his shaky handwriting. Inside was a letter dated 6 months earlier, along with something that made my breath catch, his original commission papers from the Korean War, and a faded photograph of him receiving the Silver Star. But it was the letter that changed everything. My dearest Sarah, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm probably looking down at you from whatever foxhole they've assigned me in the afterlife. I've been watching your career from afar, and I want you to know something that no one else has had the courage to tell you. You're not just a good soldier, you're a revolutionary one. I've been making calls, using old connections, asking questions about your work. Do you know that your cyber defense strategy has been briefed to the Secretary of Defense? That your training protocols are being studied at the War College? That intelligence agencies in 3 allied countries have requested copies of your tactical assessments? You've been creating ripples that are becoming waves, even if the people around you are too small-minded to see it. But here's what worries me. I also know you're being held back. I know about Morrison, about Stone, about all the ways they've tried to diminish your contributions. I've seen this before, sweetheart. During my time, they did it to black soldiers, to anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of leadership. Don't let them break you. Don't let them convince you that their limitations are your reality. You have something they fear. the ability to see solutions they can't imagine, and the courage to implement them. Use that gift, but protect it. Document everything. Build your own network. And when the time comes, and you'll know when it comes, don't wait for permission to be extraordinary. The letter ended with coordinates, latitude and longitude numbers that meant nothing to me at first. Then I remembered. It was our old treasure hunting game from when I was young. I plugged the coordinates into my phone and found they led to a storage unit across town. Inside that storage unit was a filing cabinet containing 20 years of Grandpa Thunder's correspondence with military leaders, defense contractors, and policymakers. He'd been quietly promoting my work, sending copies of my published articles to people who mattered, building a network of allies I never knew I had. At the bottom of the cabinet was a thick folder labeled Sarah's Future. Inside were letters of recommendation from generals I'd never met, invitations to speak at conferences I'd never heard of, and a scholarship application to the Advanced War College, fully completed except for my signature. Grandpa Thunder died the next morning. At his funeral, men in uniform I'd never seen before approached me with condolences and comments about my impressive theoretical work in asymmetric warfare and my innovative approaches to modern military challenges. I realized he'd been fighting a parallel campaign for my career while I'd been fighting alone on the front lines. Standing at his graveside, wearing my dress blues while Dad fidgeted uncomfortably nearby, I made a decision. I would stop waiting for the system to recognize me. I would apply for that war college position, attend those conferences, and build the career Grandpa Thunder knew I was capable of. But first, I had one more fight to finish. The moment of truth came at Dad's 60th birthday party, 3 weeks after Grandpa Thunder's funeral. I had just received my acceptance letter to the Advanced War College, the same program that had rejected me twice before Grandpa's network of allies intervened. I also carried a commendation letter from General Patricia recommending me for accelerated promotion based on my, quote, exceptional strategic innovations. I walked into our family home wearing my dress blues, hoping this time Dad might finally see me as something more than his daughter playing soldier. The living room was filled with his accounting colleagues, country club friends, and business associates, people who measured success in quarterly profits and golf handicaps. Dad was holding court near the fireplace, regaling his guests with stories about building his firm from nothing. When he saw me, his face tightened with that familiar look of disappointment. "There's my daughter," he announced to the room, his voice carrying that apologetic tone I'd heard my entire life, still playing soldier instead of getting a real job. The room went silent. I felt every eye on me, saw the polite smiles that said they agreed with him, but something inside me snapped, not into anger, into clarity. "Actually, Dad, I need to share some news with everyone." I pulled out my phone and opened the email that had arrived that morning. The subject line read, "Confidential, Pentagon Strategic Advisory Position. I've been selected for something called the World Security Conference," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Apparently, the Pentagon wants me to present my cyber warfare strategies to defense ministers from 37 countries. Dad's expression shifted from embarrassment to confusion. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" I continued reading from the email. "The selection committee called my approach to digital battlefield tactics, paradigm shifting, and, quote, essential to future national security. I'll be the youngest military strategist in U.S. history to brief the Joint Chiefs on international policy." The room was dead quiet now. I could see Dad's business friends exchanging glances, suddenly reassessing the woman they'd dismissed as his problem child. But I wasn't finished. I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation I'd been preparing for weeks. "Since we're all here, let me show you what I actually do for a living." For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through my career accomplishments. The cyber defense system that was now protecting critical infrastructure across 12 allied nations. The training protocols that had reduced military casualties by 35%. The strategic assessments that were being taught at West Point as required curriculum. I showed them screenshots of emails from NATO commanders, letters from defense contractors, and articles from military journals featuring my work. I displayed my security clearance level, my list of classified projects, and the salary range for my upcoming Pentagon position. Dad's face went through a series of transformations as I spoke: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that might have been pride, though it was hard to tell through his shock. When I finished, his business partner, a man I'd known since childhood, broke the silence. "Richard, do you realize your daughter is essentially a Pentagon advisor? Do you understand what kind of security clearance she must have?" Dad looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Sarah, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" "I tried, Dad. For years I tried. But every time I came home in uniform, you introduced me as the daughter who joined the army like it was something embarrassing. You never once asked what I actually did or what I'd accomplished." The room remained silent as I packed up my laptop. The Pentagon called this morning. The World Security Conference isn't just an honor. It's a career-defining moment that could lead to positions most military officers can only dream of. I looked directly at Dad. "So you're right about one thing. I won't be playing soldier much longer. I'll be commanding them." I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. "The party's lovely, Dad. Congratulations on your birthday." 3 days later, my phone rang with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Major Reynolds, this is Colonel Anderson from Pentagon Strategic Operations. You've been selected for the World Security Conference as the youngest military strategist in U.S. history. Can you be in Washington by Friday?" The call should have been the culmination of everything I'd worked for. Instead, it became the beginning of the most challenging period of my career. Because success at the highest levels of military leadership comes with targets painted on your back. The moment my Pentagon assignment was announced, the retaliation began. Colonel Harrison, my commanding officer at Fort Bragg, called me into his office with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of disbelief and barely contained resentment. "Reynolds, I don't know what strings you pulled or who you know in Washington, but this assignment is highly irregular for someone of your rank and experience level." "Sir, I was selected based on my strategic work and published research. Published research that was developed using military resources and should have gone through proper command channels," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been reviewing your file, and there are some concerning patterns of insubordination and failure to follow collaborative protocols." I realized he was building a case against me. Every time I'd bypassed the system that was stealing my work, every article I'd published independently, every conference where I'd spoken without going through proper channels, it was all being reframed as evidence of poor military discipline. "Sir, are you questioning my fitness for the Pentagon assignment?" "I'm documenting my concerns for your permanent record. The military values team players, Major Reynolds. Lone wolves don't advance in this organization." Over the next 2 weeks, my life became a bureaucratic nightmare. Harrison subjected me to additional performance reviews, questioned my security clearance, and delayed my transfer paperwork. Meanwhile, I discovered that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had been spreading rumors about my unstable behavior and tendency toward insubordination. The most devastating blow came when Captain Bradley Stone was suddenly assigned as my co-presenter for the World Security Conference. Despite having no experience in cyber warfare strategy and minimal understanding of international security protocols, Stone would be joining me in Washington to provide tactical balance to my theoretical approach. I spent sleepless nights preparing for a presentation that might be undermined by someone who could barely pronounce asymmetric warfare. But the real challenge wasn't Stone, it was the isolation. Officers who had previously been friendly became distant. Colleagues stopped, including me in informal meetings. I was being systematically excluded from the networks that make military careers possible. The breakthrough moment came from an unexpected source. Captain Jennifer Martinez, the officer whose training program had been stolen and credited to Major Thompson, approached me in the commissary. "Sarah, I know what they're doing to you," she said quietly. "They did it to me too, just not as publicly, but I want you to know, there are others of us watching. Women officers who've had their work stolen, their contributions minimized, their careers stunted." She slid a piece of paper across the table. "These are contact numbers for officers at other bases who've experienced similar treatment. We've been talking, documenting, building our own network." That paper contained 12 names of women officers across different branches, different ranks, different specialties. All of them had experienced systematic undermining of their careers. All of them had been fighting the same battles I was fighting. just individually and in silence. For the first time since the Pentagon call, I didn't feel alone. Jennifer, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time we stopped fighting this battle separately. You're going to Washington with visibility none of us have ever had. If you succeed, if you prove that competence matters more than politics, it changes things for all of us. And if I fail, then we'll still be here, ready to try again. I looked at those 12 names and realized I wasn't just representing myself at the World Security Conference. I was carrying the hopes of every woman officer who'd been told she wasn't strategic enough, collaborative enough, or leadership material enough to advance. The Pentagon's Situation Room was more intimidating than any battlefield I'd ever encountered. 37 defense ministers, 4-star generals, and intelligence directors from allied nations sat around a massive oval table, their combined authority representing the security apparatus of the free world. Captain Stone sat beside me, nervously adjusting his tie and fumbling with his briefing notes. He'd spent the flight to Washington asking me to explain basic concepts he should have mastered years ago, but I was no longer worried about his presence undermining me. I had something more powerful than his political connections. I had the truth. My presentation began with a simple question. What if everything we think we know about cyber warfare is wrong? For the next hour, I dismantled conventional wisdom about digital security. I explained how traditional defensive strategies were like building higher walls while enemies were learning to fly. I demonstrated how my 3-tier system had successfully repelled actual attacks on military infrastructure, showing real-time data from classified operations. But the moment that changed everything came when General Morrison, not Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, but his father, a Joint Chiefs member, interrupted my presentation. Major Reynolds, this is impressive theoretical work, but how do we know these strategies work under actual combat conditions? I smiled and pulled up a classified file I'd been authorized to share just that morning. Sir, 3 weeks ago, Chinese hackers attempted to penetrate our Pacific Fleet communications network. They used a sophisticated AI-driven attack that would have succeeded against conventional defenses. The room went completely silent. Instead, they walked directly into my digital maze system. Not only did we repel their attack, but we traced it back to its source, identified the specific military unit responsible, and fed them false intelligence about our submarine positions that led them to waste 3 months of operational planning. The defense ministers began leaning forward, asking technical questions, requesting implementation timelines. Stone tried to interject twice with superficial observations, but it was clear who commanded the room's attention. By the end of the presentation, I had received requests for private briefings from 6 different nations and an offer to head the new NATO Cyber Defense Initiative. The Secretary of Defense pulled me aside afterward. Major Reynolds, we've been watching your work for longer than you know. Your grandfather's friends made sure we understood what kind of asset you represent. We're prepared to offer you something unprecedented. The offer was staggering: promotion to lieutenant colonel, assignment to the Pentagon's Strategic Innovation Division, and oversight of cybersecurity protocols for all allied nations. I would be the youngest officer ever appointed to such a position. But the real vindication came 3 days later when news of my Pentagon appointment reached the media. Military Times ran a feature story titled, quote, "The Strategist Who Revolutionized Cyber Warfare." Defense News called me the military's most innovative tactical thinker. CNN interviewed me about the future of digital battlefield tactics. Captain Jennifer Martinez called me from Fort Bragg. "Sarah, you did it. Every woman officer on this base is talking about your success. You proved that competence matters." The network of women officers that Jennifer had introduced me to began reaching out. They wanted mentorship, advice, and connections. I realized I wasn't just building my own career anymore. I was creating a pathway for others. Within 6 months, my cyber defense protocols were implemented across all U.S. military branches. 3 women officers from Jennifer's network received promotions after demonstrating innovations in their own specialties. The Pentagon created a new fast-track program for recognizing tactical innovations, regardless of the officer's rank or gender. The most satisfying moment came when I received a formal request from Fort Bragg. Colonel Harrison wanted me to return as a guest lecturer to teach my cyber warfare strategies to incoming officers. I politely declined. I had more important work to do in Washington. But I did send a personal note to Captain Stone, who was struggling in his new assignment. Leadership isn't about who you know, I wrote. It's about what you know and how well you can apply it under pressure. The call came 6 months after my Pentagon appointment, just as I was reviewing intelligence reports in my new office overlooking the Potomac. The voice on the other end was familiar but subdued. It was Dad. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what happened at my birthday party, about everything you said. I think we need to talk." His voice carried something I'd never heard before, genuine humility. "Your mother and I would like to visit you in Washington, if you're willing to see us." 3 days later, I met them at Reagan National Airport. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, less certain of himself. Mom walked beside him with nervous energy, clutching a folder against her chest like armor. But it was what Dad wore that surprised me most. A small American flag pin on his lapel, the kind military families display to show pride in their service member. We drove to my apartment in Arlington in relative silence, the weight of years of misunderstanding filling the car. Once we were seated in my living room, Dad looked around at the military commendations on my walls, the photos of me with generals and defense ministers, the official Pentagon credentials displayed in frames. "Sarah," he began, his voice breaking slightly, "I owe you an apology that's about 20 years overdue." Mom opened the folder she'd been carrying and pulled out newspaper clippings, printed emails, and magazine articles. "We've been researching," she said quietly. "After your birthday presentation, we realized we had no idea what you actually do, so we started learning." Dad picked up a copy of Defense Weekly with my photo on the cover. "I called my business partner's son. He works for a defense contractor. He told me that you're considered one of the most influential military strategists of your generation, that your cyber warfare protocols are being studied at military academies worldwide. I also learned something else," he continued, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in years. "I learned the starting salary for a Pentagon strategic operations officer is significantly higher than what I make running my accounting firm." Despite everything, I almost smiled. Of course, Dad would ultimately understand success in financial terms. "But that's not why I'm here apologizing," he said quickly. "I'm here because I finally understand what I was too stubborn to see before. You weren't playing soldier. You were becoming something I was too limited to comprehend." Mom leaned forward. "Sarah, we attended a military appreciation dinner last month. They had a guest speaker, a retired general who spoke about women in combat leadership roles. He specifically mentioned your work, called you the future of strategic military thinking. We sat there realizing our daughter was the person he was praising, and we'd spent years making you feel ashamed of your service." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd ever had. Dad admitted that his dismissal of my career had been rooted in fear. Fear that he didn't understand my world, fear that I was growing beyond his ability to relate to me, and fear that my success highlighted his own limitations. "I spent so many years trying to convince you to choose a path I could understand," he said. "I never stopped to consider that maybe I should try to understand the path you'd chosen." Mom pulled out one final item from her folder, a handwritten letter addressed to me. "This came to our house last week," she said. "It's from the Secretary of Defense's office, inviting us to a ceremony where you're receiving some kind of distinguished service award." I looked at the invitation. I hadn't told them about the ceremony because I'd assumed they wouldn't be interested. "We'd like to attend," Dad said, "if you'll have us. And Sarah, I'd like to learn more about what you do. Not because I finally approve, but because I want to understand the daughter I'm proud of." For the first time in decades, when Dad introduced me to people, it wasn't with embarrassment or apology. It was with the kind of pride that comes from finally recognizing excellence, even when it appears in forms you never expected. 2 years later, I stood at the podium in the Pentagon's main auditorium, looking out at an audience that would have been unimaginable when I was a second lieutenant filing reports and making coffee runs. The occasion was the inaugural Women in Strategic Leadership Conference, and I had been asked to deliver the keynote address. In the front row sat my parents, both wearing small American flag pins now, their faces beaming with a pride that had taken decades to develop. Next to them was Captain Jennifer Martinez, recently promoted to major and now heading the Army's new Innovation Recognition Program. Behind them were dozens of women officers whose careers had flourished in the wake of the changes we'd implemented together. But it was the young woman in the third row who captured my attention most completely. Second Lieutenant Maria Santos, fresh out of West Point, held a small notebook and hung on every word. She reminded me of myself 20 years earlier, brilliant, determined, and completely unaware of the battles she would have to fight just to be heard. 3 years ago, I began, I stood outside a room and was told there wasn't space for me inside. Not because I lacked qualifications, not because I hadn't earned my place, but because the people controlling that space couldn't imagine a world where someone like me belonged at their table. I paused, scanning the faces before me. Today, I want to talk about what happens when you stop waiting for permission to be extraordinary. I told them about Grandpa Thunder's compass, which now sat on my Pentagon desk next to photos of me briefing NATO commanders and designing cyber defense strategies for allied nations. I spoke about the network of women officers who had supported each other through systematic undermining and career sabotage. I explained how documenting our contributions and building independent recognition had created opportunities that the traditional system would never have provided. But the real victory, I continued, isn't my promotion to colonel, or my appointment as Director of Strategic Innovation, or even the presidential commendation I received last month for developing the cyber defense protocols that prevented 3 major international incidents. I looked directly at Lieutenant Santos. The real victory is that tomorrow, a young woman will graduate from West Point and join a military where her innovations won't be stolen, where her strategic thinking will be recognized, and where her path to leadership won't require her to fight the same battles we fought. After the speech, Lieutenant Santos approached me with nervous energy and determined eyes. Colonel Reynolds, I've been developing some ideas about integrating artificial intelligence with battlefield logistics. Everyone says it's too ambitious for a junior officer, but after hearing your story, I smiled, remembering my own desperate attempts to share innovative ideas with officers who saw me as a threat rather than an asset. Lieutenant, ambitious is exactly what we need. Let's talk. Over the next hour, she outlined a strategy for using machine learning to predict supply chain vulnerabilities in combat zones. Her thinking was sophisticated, original, and exactly the kind of innovation the military needed from its newest officers. Under the old system, her ideas would have been buried, stolen, or dismissed. Under the new system we'd built, they would be fast-tracked for development and properly credited. Lieutenant Santos, I'm going to connect you with the Strategic Innovation Review Board. They meet monthly to evaluate new concepts from officers at all ranks. Your logistics AI proposal will be reviewed on its merits, not your rank. 6 months later, Lieutenant Santos's AI system was being tested at 3 military bases. She was promoted ahead of schedule and assigned to the Pentagon's Emerging Technologies Division. Her success story became another example of what was possible when competence was valued over politics. But the legacy that mattered most to me was personal. Last month, Dad called me with news that surprised us both. His accounting firm had been selected to handle financial planning for a major defense contractor, and the client specifically requested him because his daughter was the renowned Pentagon strategist Sarah Reynolds. You know what's funny? He said during that call. For years, I thought your military career would hold you back from success. Turns out, your success elevated me. The story that began with a compass and a grandfather's faith in my potential had become something larger than either of us imagined. It became proof that when you refuse to accept limitations others place on you, you don't just change your own trajectory, you create new possibilities for everyone who comes after you. Every time a young woman officer receives recognition for her strategic thinking, every time an innovation is credited to its actual creator regardless of rank or gender, every time the system chooses merit over politics, Grandpa Thunder's compass continues pointing toward true north. And that direction is always forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.